Good morning. Okay, we are in Numbers chapter 27. We're going to just hit some highlights at the end of 26 here regarding some application, and then we're getting into Numbers 27, Numbers chapter 27. So as we finished up Numbers 26, and I recognize that when you look at Numbers 26 and you see all those numbers and names and everything, you may have flashbacks to the first of the book, to the beginning of the book. And even then we tried to, the way we navigated that is just to try to realize what the purpose of that is, okay? And we did that early on, and the same is true here. What's significant about Numbers 26 as far as how the whole book of Numbers lays out? Anybody? No? Yeah, it's the second census. So the book of Numbers, it's the second census. The first census was early on. What was the first census for when we began? Why does that matter, all that counting? Anybody remember at the beginning of the book? Why did they count?
Counting for the people that left.
Yes. So the counting of the people, the counting of the men prepared them for warfare that would eventually be expected if they were going to go to the promised land. Okay. So that also, other nations did that, but in this case it was to remind them that they were in defense of truth and that God would bless them with power and might from his hand, etc. Okay. Now remember we talked about the Levites were counted separately from that census. And how old were the men who got counted? What was the minimum age? Do you remember? 20 and above. That's right. So when we looked at that, we realized, okay, there's this census going on, but it was for some really important reasons. It was to really get them to see God was going to be with them, and they had the ability to do what God said, and he would bless them with his power. Now, the first 10 chapters of Numbers, how does that go? When they're stationary, first 10 chapters, very obedient to God. They have the organization, the pattern, all that looks good. What happens after that when you start to get into the latter part of chapter 10 and then into chapter 11? At that point, what happens? They murmuring, complaining, rebelling. We eventually get later on, you're going to have Korah. You have all this rebellion. You have all of this. God brings judgment on them. And so as a result of all of that, what happens? What judgment does God bring because of that? Gentlemen.
Different types of punishment that God, Korah and his family.
Right. Swallowed up. Korah was swallowed up. Yeah.
Others had plagues.
So you have all these kinds of judgments that Mike's talking about. If we were to really kind of back away, so you have all these judgments, and there's a lot of death, by the way, but then also you see God's mercy. You'll see atonement. And we have this whole Levitical system going on. What was probably, if I could say, the biggest, most broad sweeping result of their disobedience, like with the spies or the scouts that came back and the majority of them were not faithful, what was the consequence of that? There you go. They didn't get to go into the promised land because remember, geographically, they're right. I mean, they're going to end up being right there. So they end up going in circles because of their rebellion to God, not because it was a long distance for them at that point. So they wander around and you have all of this. Out of those people, who ends up getting to go into the promised land? Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses and Aaron and Miriam, and this comes out in chapter 27 again. Why do Moses and Aaron not get to go into the promised land? They sinned in a similar way that the children of Israel had before. And we'll talk more about that again, but we covered that in some detail. Okay, so there's a second generation. So you have the first generation, and you had that census to prepare them to go, and they could have gone to the promised land, but they were rebellious to God. And it was frustrating for Moses and Aaron and all of that. So, and we've talked about Balaam and Balak without revisiting all that. We went into detail about that. And last week we saw sexual immorality come in on the scene. But then when we get to as we think about chapter 26, the second census is significant. What did it show Israel about God, that second census? What did it reveal? So they do this second census. It's a second generation. Well, yeah, that was right. A lot of people are, but what it ultimately, and you're right, Richard, but ultimately, if you look at the numbers, there wasn't, in the totality, there wasn't much difference between the numbers of the second generation and the first generation, which means they're going to get to go to the promised land. Now, there were some tribes that fluctuated. Some were more, some were less. But at the end of the day, they were just as strong, just as powerful after all of this by God's grace and mercy. So it shows God's faithfulness. Now, it does two things, and that's what we were noticing at the end as you look at the end of chapter 26. And he gives a couple of highlighted examples, and you have all this counting going on. But it does two things. Number one, regarding God's faithfulness, it was important for them to recognize the warning here. We've talked a little bit about that. But when you go back to the spies, and the majority come back, and they come back and they give this evil report and that kind of thing. You have Joshua and Caleb giving a good report, and we know there's consequences. What should the second generation learn? Now, they've made some mistakes too, especially with this sexual immorality that had happened and what Phinehas did and showing the zeal of God and God's righteous judgment there. So they need to learn from that, because they're right on the precipice here of being able to enter the promised land. And that is, when the Lord promises judgment to the disobedient, he carries that out. So don't think if God says, if you disobey me, there will be consequences, that he doesn't mean that, or somehow he's going to change his mind about that if you continue to be disobedient. But we also find out from that standpoint, to balance that, the Lord's compassionate. So if you look at Exodus 34:7, the Lord is indeed compassionate, gracious, and forgiving, but he does not leave the guilty unpunished. So if you're in the second generation, you just had this Israelite man ignore the consequences of what was happening to the others with this plague because of idolatry and sexual immorality. Phinehas dealt with that. What did Phinehas do to those who were to the couple that was involved in sexual immorality? Killed them, okay? And how did God respond to that? He relented from the punishment. Okay, so what does the second generation need to learn? Don't be like the first generation. And don't be like that generation, because God will carry out judgment. And of course, and we've talked about this, but if you come to Hebrews 3:7 through 4:11, a lot of this is mentioned, and we are warned as Christians. So in Hebrews 3 and 4, those who did not enter, Paul says, or the Hebrew writer says, that the ones who did not enter into this rest, that first generation we've been talking about, why does he say they didn't enter in? Unbelief. But he uses two phrases, and you're right, Kelton. Unbelief and what else? Disobedience. And that's interesting, because he uses the terms unbelief and disobedience interchangeably. Sometimes we don't think of unbelief that way, but the Bible uses unbelief that way. It wasn't that they were atheists. It's that they were disobeying God. And in Numbers, isn't that how we've seen it described? Their disobedience has been described as a lack of trust in God's promises. And that's what we show God when we disobey him. And so we see that in Hebrews. So there's plenty for us to learn here. So this first generation is a warning of what not to do for us today, and it should have been a warning for that second generation. So God does not look lightly on rebellion to him, even under the new covenant. Let's read Hebrews 10:26 through 31, just to make that point. Hebrews 10, verses 26 through 31. We're going to look at that. Bo, can you get that for me?
For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
Thank you. What's worse than physical death? Eternal punishment. Yeah, if there is no eternal punishment, by the way, those verses don't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think he's saying, hey, there's something worse, you'll cease to exist. That's not what he's saying. He's saying what's worse is eternal separation from God, okay? Now, there's something else we see from this, though. There is the warning, and they need to get the warning. But God's faithfulness is also a great encouragement. And again, why have another census? Well, God knew what the numbers looked like. It wasn't to give him any information. It was for their benefit. It was for the children of Israel to know. God's really, even through all the judgments and all the loss and all the death and all of that, God has been with us the whole way. And he'll continue to be with us. Victory was before them. You can see that in 26:2. So there's a couple of things. The other thing is, it's encouragement of what can be accomplished, but what is going to happen regarding land once they get to the promised land? Divided up. Yeah, it's divided up. It's distributed out. That's God's promise coming to fruition. He promised them. You remember all the way through, they were like, well, you made all these promises. Let's just go back to Egypt. It was so wonderful in Egypt after all. So let's go back to Egypt. No, this is all coming to fruition. God is true to his promises. And so there's warning, there's also encouragement, and we've talked about those other aspects. So when we get into chapter 27, it's kind of interesting, but here's what I want you to do when we look at 27, and even later on. Now 28 and 29, we're going to be back into talking about some of the laws that we're already familiar with. But what I want to do with these chapters is us just get real big in our perception of things. So as we're going to look at some details, but what are we learning about God when we go through chapter 27, chapter 28, chapter 29, and 30? What are we learning about God? What are we learning about the relationship Israel was to have with God? And what can we even learn about how we approach God today? So no matter what details we might look at, if you would, just keep that in your mind, and that'll keep the right framework on things so we don't get lost or anything like that. But when you look at Numbers 27, he's going to start talking about the law of inheritance. As I mentioned to you in your notes, the promises and the law given in chapters 27 through 30 imply a few things. Number one, they imply they'll conquer the land. In fact, when you just quickly, I want you to look at this in your Bible. If you look at, even if you have some titles at the top of these sections, they kind of help in your Bible. So chapter 27, it talks about a law of inheritance. We'll talk about Joshua succeeding Moses. But then when you look at 28, you go, okay, he's talking about laws for offerings, and we get back into these days of celebration and offerings of the 7th month. And chapter 30 talks about the law of the vows. And at that point, most people go, oh, I think I'm going to go read Philippians. Okay? So just what I want us to see, though, is even though that's very technical, there are some big ideas that come from that. Remember, we've come through this wandering of the wilderness, and they're here. What does all that indicate? Now, here's the interesting thing. When you get into chapters 28 and 29, some of this they can do right now, but not all of it. I mean, but some of it doesn't seem like it really fits where they're located and what's going on. Yeah, they're worshiping God and doing all that, but why would you talk to them now about doing these things and about some of these laws if they're not actually able to do every technical detail right now? You got them all together in one place, and it indicates we're going to the promised land. And you need to know all of this for now, yeah. But you also, the nation, and this is important to what Darrell is going to say here, these things have been mentioned in other places, and we'll talk about this later, but I mean, Leviticus talks about it earlier, Numbers talks about it, Exodus talks about it. So it's not like what you're reading here in Numbers. Now, you do have a second generation, but it's not like we can't read about this anywhere else. But when you read about it in the other places, it's more about individually as Jewish servants of God, do this, do this, do this, do this, right? Now, that was as a nation, but it has a more individual feel. You make sure and do this. And if you sin, this is what happens. And this is how the Levitical process works and all that. That's not really why he tells them again here. And going back to what Daryl said, it's very much a national kind of group as we move from here into Canaan. As a nation of people, you can be successful in God's mission for you only if you keep God at the center of your life as a nation and as individuals. Okay? Does that make sense? So remember, and this is interesting. I know we've talked about this a lot in our study. Worship all the way through the Pentateuch. I mean, all the way through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. How vital is worship for God's people in accomplishing His will as a nation and as individuals? Extremely vital. I mean, it's absolutely essential. And it is very interesting because I think there's been some pushback to this, but for a good bit of time, there has been a tendency, and among our brethren in the religious world at large, I think, to make worship feel like it's kind of this secondary thing, and it's good if you do it, but not necessarily vital to your relationship with God. I mean, some people really have that idea, that notion. It's kind of like, here's my relationship with God, and worship, yeah, it's about right here. That's not how the Bible presents it, ever, in the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. And that is that while our corporate gathered together worship is not all there is to our life for God, certainly there's a very personal aspect to my relationship with God. I can't have a relationship with God and be indifferent about worship to God, right? So that comes out in these chapters too. And so you'll see him just reviewing that. But my point to you is even the technical commandments and laws show confidence that we're going to be going to Canaan. We're going to overcome our adversaries. We're going to overcome our enemies. And so these chapters are, yes, very important. Now, we get to chapter 27. It's kind of an interesting section here. We're going to notice verses 1 through 11. But what happens is they're thinking about this inheritance and doling out the inheritance and the land inheritance and how important that was. There's going to be a situation, and a woman comes to Moses, and do you remember what she basically argues or says? Roger?
And she had no descendants.
With our father. Her father had died, that's right. There's no males there for that. Yeah, so let's say you're in that family and my father dies, okay, she as a daughter, her father dies. This is so important. I mean, they're getting ready. What are we going to do for our family? And you just have to realize how important that was to them. And here they are, and she says, and we're going to read this, but what's her reasoning? Does anybody remember? I mean, we'll read the text. What? Go ahead, Richard.
Why should her father's name be removed?
Right. Now, had her father sinned? Yeah. Yeah, he sinned, but she says he kind of paid the price for his own sin from an individual standpoint. But what did he not do? That she says, I would understand if this had happened. Anybody remember? Who did he not get involved with? Korah. Okay, so there were some real consequences. Some of the men, and this is the implication, not Korah. Now Korah's family line kind of continues, but some of the men associated with Korah, their family line got wiped out. That's the implication. She's saying, if you've been with Korah, I get it. I understand that because that was a massive rebellion there against the leadership. But yeah, he sinned, but he wasn't involved in that. Okay, so let's read it together. And notice how caring he is about this. So chapter 27, verse 1. Then the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, of the families of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, came near. And there are the names of his daughters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, and Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the leaders and all the congregation at the doorway of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness, yet he was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but he died in his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be withdrawn from among his family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So Moses brought their case before the Lord. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, The daughters of Zelophehad are right in their statements. You shall surely give them a hereditary possession among their father's brothers, and you shall transfer the inheritance of their father to them. Further, you shall speak to the sons of Israel, saying, If a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give the inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his nearest relative in his own family, and he shall possess it, and he shall be a statutory ordinance to the sons of Israel, just as the Lord commanded Moses. And then the Lord said to Moses, Go up to this mountain of Abarim and see the land which I have given to the sons of Israel. We'll pause there because we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. So if somebody says, hey, what about a wife? Well, there were provisions for the wife. You remember the Levirate law thing? Does anybody remember? Okay, so you got the blessing of getting to marry your brother-in-law. All right. But there was a way of taking care of a woman whose husband died. The whole story of Naomi and all of that situation. So Naomi and Ruth and the loss of her husband and sons, Mahlon and Chilion and all that. Okay. But this is a different situation. I mean, think if you're a daughter and this is provision for your family and there's no sons, that's nobody's really fault. You don't have any brothers that would get the inheritance. So here you are and your father dies, or you just left out in the cold. And so she brings that, and notice Moses toward her as she pleads about this. He's very caring. Now notice where they are. What's significant about where they are when you look at chapter 27 and verse 2? Who do they go to? First of all, they go to the right people. Who do they go to? Moses and? Why is Eleazar important? He's the high priest. That's right. So they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the leaders and all the congregation. And where were they? Okay. Haven't we seen that's important all the way through Numbers? What's significant about being at the doorway of the tent of meeting or the tabernacle? Why would that be important? Not a trick question, I promise. Yeah, this is representative of the presence of God. This is where worship takes place. This is where God's decisions come down to, in many ways, to Moses. Even when Aaron was alive, when Moses and Aaron, where would they go? They would go to the tent of meeting. This is where there was dialogue with God. Not that he didn't communicate at other times and places, but this is a significant place. This represents the center of their fellowship. And so let me say this. It's not like when we go buy a piece of land, okay? This is significant for her to meet them there. This is the future. This has to do with their family line, their family name, partaking of God's promises. I mean, they seem to be faithful to God. And so are they just going to be left out? And the answer is going to be no, okay? So she pleads with Moses. They come to the doorway at the tent of meeting. Their request is that their family line would continue through the promised inheritance even though their father had no sons. So they also explained, as I already mentioned to you, okay, here's a situation. We would be very understanding of that. So God would have every right to wipe that line out if he'd been standing by Korah, but he's dealt with his own sin, was not a part of that rebellion. Okay, what do we learn from her, though? What do we learn from this family, these women? What did that take? Put yourself in their situation. Courage. I mean, to go talk to Moses. It's not that your father never did sin. To go talk to Moses, to come before the congregation of all of this male leadership, and very reverent, very merciful, asking for God's mercy, begging, but it took courage. It also indicates something else about how important what does their thinking about the land and the family line indicate? That they also trust God's promises. I mean, you don't talk about this if you don't think you're going to the promised land. I mean, they have full confidence. So it's an interesting story, but to me, showing, first of all, this is I think a godly woman that comes, a godly family that comes. They recognize what's happened. They're trusting God's promises. There's no way God's response is like it is if they're somehow irreverent or rebellious. And with all the death that has happened from people who are irreverent, it does take courage, and it did take faith to really want that promise of God to be fulfilled. So it presumes the line's descent is somehow connected to owning property. It seems reasonable to suggest that any men who married landowning daughters married into the estate so you can keep the family line going. And by this means the family line would continue if you had grandsons and that kind of thing. All right, so Moses treats these women very respectfully. God certainly very understanding, agrees with their requests. And now we get these provisions of these needs. Now they're going to have to, think about this, they're going to have to work that land until there are men that can help them in that way. So here are the provisions. We're going to hit this, and then I want to get on to the latter part of chapter 27. So here were the instructions, just to be clear. If a man had a son or sons, his land was to go to him or them. According to the law, we've talked about the provisions that were already there for the wife. If he had no son, his inheritance was to go to the daughter. Okay? So for all how chauvinistic God is and terrible to women, here's a case where that's certainly not the case. If he had no brothers, the land was to, if they had no brothers, the land was to the father's brothers or uncles, and then to the nearest relative. Okay, let's get to chapter 27. And I want to pick up, let's read verses 12 through 23. Let's do 12 through 18. Eli, if you could do that. And then verses 19 through 23. Jody, if you could do that.
Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Go up to this mountain of Abarim, and see the land which I have given to the sons of Israel. So when you have seen it, you two will be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother was. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command, to treat me as holy before their eyes at the water. These are the waters of Meribah of Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin." Then Moses spoke to Yahweh, saying, "Yahweh, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go out and come in before them
Is there a previous event this kind of reminds you of? Maybe with Aaron? So Moses gets to see the promised land. And to me, this is, eventually you can read about it in Deuteronomy 34, but it's a blessing in a way, it's sad in a way. It demonstrates God's faithfulness and holiness. Does God love Moses? Yeah. You think Moses has been penitent about what he did? Sure. Yeah. And yet there are consequences. So all the sacrifices Moses made, sometimes the frustration that was involved with the people of Israel, and God's understanding, he actually is understanding of that. But this was such a grievous transgression against God's presence and God's holiness and who God is. And it was such a, in a sense, it was even though I think Moses was frustrated in the moment, and this is another lesson for us. We may say, but I was just frustrated. Do you think Moses was just frustrated? I think he was very frustrated. And the Bible indicates he was frustrated. And he was dealing with these people that were difficult to deal with. But what he and Aaron did in that moment was so undermining of God before the people that there had to be consequences. And yes, God is merciful and compassionate and gracious. But this particular thing seemed very unique in his eyes. And it is that he did not believe they were treating him as holy. Okay. Go ahead, Darryl.
It seems harsh, doesn't it?
Yeah, oh yeah, to our sensibilities, yeah.
Get past that and think about where Moses ends up.
Yeah.
And, you know, Canaan was the promised land, but that doesn't compare to heaven.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, he'll be enjoying his reward in a different way. That's right. And there's now these are consequences, but there is a transition happening that is going to be vital anyway. But I think it does seem harsh, but in another way, it's not as if Moses is in a lost condition or anything like that. That's right.
Do you consider the goodness and the severity of the Lord?
That's a good point. And here's another point to what Darryl is saying. Did y'all hear what he said, Romans 11:22, about the goodness and severity of God? But if God think about how close Moses and God were. I mean, it will even say this later. Moses had a very unique relationship with Yahweh, with the Lord. And yet, there were consequences for even Moses. And if there were consequences for even Moses because of the sin, and the nature of the sin is what I would say, and the public nature of the sin, then you can appreciate this situation. And he's been penitent. He's repented. I believe God's forgiven him. There's no doubt. He's mentioned, of course, in Hebrews 11. He is the great lawgiver. But as great a man as Moses became by God's grace and power, still there were these consequences, which was a powerful lesson for Israel to recognize as well. Okay, Roger, did you have something?
For us, because God's the same God yesterday, today, and forever.
Yeah.
He works the same way. He never changes.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at what he did then. We're not under the same law. He deals with us under a different law, but we have to obey.
His character's the same. His nature's the same.
We have to obey, and he's going to hold us accountable.
Well, and this, sometimes we think of God being a certain kind of God in the Old Testament and a different kind of God. That's just not what the Bible teaches. And secondly, we have New Testament writers pulling on numbers all the time. So we do know better than that. And so I think those are very good points. If you look at Deuteronomy 34:1, he commands Moses to go up to an area on Mount Nebo. So he has let's turn over to Deuteronomy 34. He has a really good view of Canaan. Let's go back to Deuteronomy. And there's a couple of things I want to look at in Deuteronomy 34 that I think may be helpful. We'll come back to the second thing in a minute. But Deuteronomy 34, If you look at verse 1, now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land. And he goes on and talks about Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western area, and Negev, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, and the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. And it says, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. But he got to see this beautiful land. And if you look at we've looked at the map before, if you look at the location, that it just seems like the perfect place to be able to see this land that he's been leading the people toward. Now, go back to Numbers chapter 27. God speaks of this in an interesting way. He speaks even here of having already, and in Scripture, before they actually get to the land, he says, I have given you the land. He doesn't say, I will give you the land. Now, from a time standpoint, we know it hadn't actually happened yet. They're not occupying it yet. Why do we have language like that where God is saying, I have given you the land before they get to the land? It's theirs to take. It's going to happen as long as they continue to walk in the right way. He's going to be faithful to his promise. And there's really a sense for us in which, as with the assumption that we walk with the Lord, that he's given us even what's in our future in the sense that he will be faithful. He's going to be faithful. He's going to be true to his promise. Now, if we abandon him, we're abandoning the promise. He's not abandoning the promise. We're abandoning the promise. And so you have this very kind of language here. So he takes him up, and notice verse 12, which I have given to the sons of Israel. And he mentions, when you see it, you'll be gathered to your father. Same language as we have with Aaron. He says, and as Aaron your brother was. All right. And he reminds them, now this is why, Moses. I'm not just arbitrary. While it may feel harsh to us, it may seem that way, this is why. And Moses doesn't, there's no complaining from Moses. Moses knows that that is absolutely the case. So what does Moses do at this point? Well, look at verse 15. And this tells us a lot about Moses. Moses speaks to the Lord even now, even though he knows what's going to happen. He's concerned about Israel. He's concerned about his people in a selfless way. Look at verse 15. Moses spoke to the Lord saying, may the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep which have no shepherd. So the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. Let's talk about this. So look at verse 16. He says, you're sovereign. He doesn't fight against God's decisions at all. He understands why God made this decision. He says, you're the God of the spirits of all flesh. We need the right man over this congregation, this nation of people. Look at verse 17. What does he mean by who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them out and bring them in?
Follow. As long as that leader follows God, they should follow him.
Right. That's exactly right. Be a leader. Now, I will tell you, this idea of going out and coming in is warfare language. So it is being a leader. Roger's right. But it is a leader that leads you into battle victoriously. Okay? The idea of going out with them, coming back in, is the idea of lead. There's going to be a battle here, so we need a man a strong man. We need a courageous man. But then he says something else, and this is interesting to me. He says that we need this leader who's going to not only be in a sense, a commander, a leader from a military standpoint and from a spiritual standpoint, but he's also going to shepherd the people. So he's strong and he can go to battle. Now think about this. He's strong and he can go to battle, but he's also tender and he can shepherd. Now, true leadership has to do both. Sometimes on one hand, we need somebody who can be compassionate, certainly, and shepherd. But if that same man is not able to defend God's people when there's a threat, then he's not the leader God wants him to be. Now, he may be ready to go to battle, but he may run roughshod over God's people. That's not good leadership. So it's not one or the other. And sometimes that's how we see leadership. No, he says we need both. And what's also interesting is he says, so that they will not be sheep without a shepherd. And who does that make you think of? Jesus. Actually, the names Joshua, we say Jesus, Joshua, Yeshua, however you want to say that, are very similar, and they're connected in Hebrews 4 together. And so I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that language, at least in a mild way, is saying, yes, Joshua will be that man, but Joshua serves as a type or a foreshadow of Jesus, who, by the way, will be our warrior God and good shepherd. Isn't that interesting? And I think that's right there in chapter 27. Jesus speaks of himself as the good shepherd. And so Joshua's appointed as leader of Israel. I will just make this point to you in verses 18 through 23. There's some contextual variance, and it's okay either way. If you have an Old King James Version, when he talks about the Spirit being on him, it won't be capitalized. It could be that he's saying a man that has a spirit of leadership in him, which would have been given by God. But most translations have that capitalized, which means that God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, would be on him in a special way. Not that it wasn't on him before, but it'd be with him in a special way and it would bless him. And before we're done, he says that he wants Moses to give him some of his authority. What do you think that means? Anybody? That's right. So start the process of transition. Some will argue that it's possible that there are certain gifts that Moses had that could be given to him in some way, and maybe so. But for sure, start showing that, because he's been Moses' assistant for years, but now he's going to be the leader, and that's why it's important that he be commissioned in front of the people so they'll accept him as leader. We'll stop right there.